We're going to start now talking about processing, which a couple of you had identified in the early portion of the class as the most lucrative portion of the food system. I think many of us agreed that production maybe was the most important part, although, since it is a system, it's hard to say that one part is truly more important than the rest. I mean, if one part of it goes away, all of the others sort of suffer to some degree. But it is true that processing, turning the raw material into something else, is where the big money is. Particularly when we can think of ourselves now as really the as the old book and movie title was, the children of the corn. Todd Dawson, a biologist, says if you take a look at the isotope ratios, in other words, if we examine at a cellular level what we are, is we North Americans look like corn chips with legs. You should take a moment after you watch this video to take a look and see how many products that you can find that are made from corn. Take a moment now, maybe just to think off the top of your head how many products are made from corn, and then maybe do a couple of searches and see what you come up with. You may be surprised, even those of you who know a fair amount about what might be made of corn. One thing that's worth thinking about, though, is why have processed foods taken over the marketplace? We may end up doing that in some of our discussion forums. But again, worth thinking about, because what happens with this shift to processed foods, then processors and not consumers start calling the shots on prices. So, whereas before the price of goods, we as consumers might have direct influence on. But since we no longer purchase in sufficient quantities of unprocessed goods, we're not the people who really set those prices any longer. Or, industry doesn't really respond so much to our pocketbooks. And we're shifting from what we can think of as from a chemical industrial kind of paradigm, so in other words, industrial farming, spraying lots of chemicals, to increasingly a genetic and corporate model where we have genetically modified organisms that are foisted off on us by corporations. And when we talked about production, or particularly about GMOs, we went to try to find some pros and cons about these things, and hopefully tried to keep an open mind and really took a look at what the scientific evidence was, not what we wanted to believe or what we, might feel or think about something. And like most things, we found that the jury is out. There's science to support both the pro and con point of view. But one thing is completely clear, and that is it's going to be very dangerous, or it is very dangerous, for a corporation or single source or maybe just a couple of sources to control the food supply, So the problem of the fixed stomach means that we can only eat so much, and we can only buy so much food before it spoils. So by contrast, even though we have only 2 feet, we can buy as many pairs of shoes as we want, as often as we want. So this is kind of a problem for the producers of food. In order for their businesses to grow, they have to figure out a way to get past the problem of that fixed stomach. And, hence the birth or the growth of processed foods. I mean, ever since we figured out how to preserve things back in the time of Nicolas Appert and canning, and probably to some degree before that, the kind of accidental freezing of foods and preserving them, we've obviously been interested in storing and maintaining a food surplus or a food supply. but not in the way that we're interested in doing that now. So, how do producers continue to get more money, and how do they grow their businesses? And particularly, how do food companies that are publicly traded, and by that I mean, listed on the stock, one thing that then ends up happening is that farming becomes kind of a colonial endeavor. And by that I mean, the colonial model is a richer, more powerful nation goes into another nation, typically. We certainly do see a little bit of backlash to this, particularly here in Northern California. There's obviously a growing movement for people to make their own foods, to reject processed foods, to try to eat whole natural foods as much as possible. Although I would imagine that even the best of us might find it hard to escape processed foods, particularly those of us who are going to school or teaching school and running businesses and raising families and doing all of the things that we do. It may be difficult to pass up the bag of corn chips to go along with our fresh homemade salsa. But we'll be discussing processing for this week. We'll be doing a midterm exam next week, and then we'll pick up processing again the following week.